I also want to thank Sylvia for her presentation, which I found very enlightening and very, as per normal, I have to say, and made me think a little bit more about what I'm saying. So I'm going to be saying some slightly different things to I might have been saying as well. And also thanks to Thomas, because I thought that was a very thought-provoking presentation, some very interesting ideas. And I wrote down this thing about fostering mutual recognition in the editorial practice, and it's something which I think is really important, and we are trying to do something about that, but whether we're going far enough or not is something that you may or may not tell me about later at some stage. But anyway, so I also want to thank Sylvia for making me smile. I don't often smile these days in these miserable times, because well, just things are difficult. But anyway, so thank you very much. So he says, hoping this is going to work. So, I mean, I've started this by saying a view from the periphery, and it's interesting. I mean, I feel part of the community. I feel I'm welcomed in the community, and I think that's really kind of really interesting and something that I'd like to say a little more about. And but I am outside of Latin America, and I always find this slightly troubling that you want to listen to me rather than to listen to your own community. But I'm also very conscious of the respect and the kind of position I'm in this respect, in thinking about how I should talk to you, and whether or not you should even be listening to me sometimes is kind of an interesting thought. But I am kind of on the edge, but I'm also, I think, like to be much closer. I am, I think, in the community too, in many ways as well. But it's a very odd position to be in sometimes. I am sorry I'm not in Medellin. I really enjoyed my visit there in 2019, and the background of some of these slides, in fact, the background that I'm standing in front of, are from Colombia. So you may or may not recognize some of them anyway. But so I'm sorry I can't be there, because in answer to one of Sylvia's questions, I think it's a great shame that I can't be there, because I think the physical social interaction is a massively important part of conferences, something which is very difficult to engender in a online or a hybrid format. Anyway, the other thing I want to say really on this introduction side is about the journal accounting education, which is in large part what I'm talking about today, and your involvement in that. I don't want to give the pretense that this has only come about because of me. It hasn't. Alan Sangster, who's the chief editor now, not very active as an editor really, but he's the chief editor, was clearly the editor for quite a long time before, and he had pretty close contacts with Brazil and São Paulo University anyway. So this is not a new history. It's just, in a sense, I'm trying to be an agent for trying to change the way in which we deal with the Latin American the Latin American continent really, and accounting educators in that area. So and in fact, Sylvia has been an associate editor for a long time, and before that, other people from Latin America have been involved. I put on the bottom here, not because I'm showing off or anything, but also two other things which I think are important to me. The fact that I'm also chair of the Accounting Education Special Interest Group of BAFA, and also on the Education Committee of the European Accounting Association. So I'm trying to sort of bring some notice of those things to you as well. And I've got on my last but one slide, I have a quick advert for those things which you may or may not be interested in. But anyway, this is just a very brief outline of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk a bit about my experiences with QRCA, and then a bit more which is largely giving rise to this special edition, and then a bit about the special edition and how I see this perhaps looking forward into the contributions that are coming from your area into ours. In that case, accounting education. So I'm not going to say much about this side, obviously. So my first encounter, in a sense, was I was actually teaching a USP. I was doing a small course for a few doctoral students on the development of accounting profession, and I've put in here hijacked by Sylvia. In a sense, hijacked sounds a bit of a sort of a strong word for this, but those of you who know Sylvia know how strong-willed she is, and how she can get you to do almost anything sometimes. So hijack didn't suggest it was unwilling, I have to say, but Sylvia, I think the first time I visited the department, asked me to speak to one of her PhD students, who I have to say I'm really glad I spoke to, because he's now one of our members of staff, which is really great. And also, while I was there to do this teaching. I didn't even know that QRCA existed. But while I was there, Sylvia said, well, why don't you come across the road to where we're meeting to talk about, well, QRCA issues? So I did. And I found some of the presentations there absolutely astounding, and pretty emotional too, actually, in some of them. Particularly a couple of presentations by students looking into issues about the profession and how the profession treats people and how people develop, which is all, in my mind, part of accounting education. I don't think accounting education stops at the university door. And that was kind of exciting, really, as well as kind of daunting in some other respects too. I was also felt very welcomed by the community, both personally and as I put here as a representative from, and I'm not sure where from. I think partly about the journal, but partly because I think I was only one of 2 or 3 outsiders in inverted commas at this conference. There weren't very many of us that I recall, and it was really interesting to be, and honoured to actually to be asked to speak to people and to give some views from outside, which I found quite interesting. Well, I found very interesting, I have to say. I shouldn't say quite. So anyway, so that's how I was kind of brought into the thing and excited about the way in which accounting education was considered very seriously here in many respects, but also very conflicted in other respects, because it came clear to me that there were certain things happening which didn't seem to be acceptable to my view of the way that accounting education should be, although it's quite a common perspective, which I'll talk about a bit more later. I then went to Bogota and talked a little bit about qualitative critical accounting education, how we should be fostering those ideas, and thinking about how you know, in a sense, there was a lot of more people there, a lot of more interest in my area, and there's quite a lot of deep thought about how we might go about doing accounting education research, or just going about doing accounting education in a deeper, more thoughtful, more understanding way. And it's clear that some of those issues are issues which we can learn from a different perspective, from a UK or European or whatever perspective too. One of the things that became kind of obvious was the enthusiasm and the passion for these things. It was clearly because of the nature of the conference, I guess, a very high interest in qualitative stuff, a high interest in critical thought and how we might do things better, really, or get better results in some progressive sense. And there was also quite a lot of discussion about issues to do with, I've said here, progressive issues. I'm not quite sure if progressive is the right word, and of course English is my only language really, so I should be getting the right words, but I don't feel quite happy with that word. But issues to do with the more difficult things to deal with, the things to do with gender and sexuality and issues like that, and to deal with issues of power relationships between staff and students, which are really important and really difficult and not often talked about in most communities. So I think that was really quite, very interesting and quite enlightening again. These of course are coffee husks, but anyway, from the farm behind me here. So really this made me think even more. These two meetings in particular made me think much more deeply about what the situations are and what perhaps the Latin American example, the Latin American experience, could add to our understanding in accounting education in a very broad way, really. One of the things that became obvious was the massive variety of university and higher education contexts. Clearly, they're not all the same, and I think Thomas referred to that too. The different ways in which communities work are probably different in different countries, but it's really good to see that QRCA is trying to build a community, at least of some of those groups, and perhaps some of the people who are subjected to the discipline of the pragmatic blindness, which is a phrase I've pinched from one of the papers and that's been submitted to the journal recently, I have to say. And I'm probably not using it in quite the same way that is being used in that paper, but it is clear to me from talking to people that just as there is in many parts of the world, there's a paradigm of quantitative methods in research. There's a paradigm which seems to, probably even more than in the UK, but not all of the UK, put more value on technique and technology than on thought. And I thought the ways in which people there were trying to deal with this was quite interesting. Clearly, I began to recognise the problems of the literature. The literature is written from our perspective, and one of the things that I have often said in my editorial decisions are, okay, this is an interesting paper perhaps, but why would my international audience read it? And quite often it's possible that I'm interpreting that to be, why would my Western / Northern international audience be interested in this? And this is clearly something which is not an appropriate way to be thinking about this. And I began to realize that perhaps, well, no, not perhaps, I certainly should be thinking about that more egalitarianly. But I do think it's important that we write for the audience, which we're trying to address, but also that we increase our audience. I think that's also important. And I think the other thing which becomes obvious is how difficult it is to access some of this literature because it's expensive. It's not provided free. Our journal's not provided free. Some of the papers in it are, but the journal as a whole isn't. And this can be a big problem to some institutions. In fact, it's quite often a problem with American papers too, because they don't necessarily use our journal. They tend to use American ones, but that's another issue really. But there's also an issue about the publication culture. And one of the things that became obvious to me, and you'll see on my last slide, I refer back to this, there's a high emphasis on publishing in the local journals, rather than, my initial thought was, telling your story to the world. Perhaps it's more important, however, to tell it locally on some occasions. And also the language issue became evident, and most obviously, really, because both these conferences the Bogota conference, almost everything was translated for us external people. So the QRCA put on live interpreters for all the events, pretty much. And I began to think, well, we don't do this. We just assume that people coming to our conferences speak or can understand in English. And how egalitarian in the sense that was, particularly seeing as a lot of the cost I expected this was for translating into English, not between Spanish and Portuguese, which is clearly a much more local issue. But also the way in which it becomes clear. I mean, you kind of know this really, but it becomes clear when you talk to people just how costly it is for people to deal with that comment, which you quite often see in reviews and sometimes in decisions. I hope I don't give this too often, but before you resubmit, you should have this professionally translated or professionally checked. And you think, well, okay, perhaps that's not a big issue for me. I have many colleagues in my institution for whom English isn't their first language, who routinely have their papers checked for English, and the university pays for it as part of its normal services. But clearly this is not the case in many institutions. And also a lot of the social and political issues that are around. I have to say in Bogota it is particularly obvious when we arrived that there was I'm not going to say, well, I almost said a student demonstration just outside the hotel, and the police were dispersing them with tear gas. So the strength of feeling in the academy, in that case from students, was clearly very strong. I'm not going to what I understand the reasons for it were, but much more like universities were when I was a student, when we were always politically engaged with, let's say that, with the institutions, but is now almost never happened. So also made me think about breaking new ground and the way in which QRCA was breaking new ground. I became aware at that conference that CPA were doing this multi-language experiment with the submissions to their journal. And put it bluntly, Sylvia said, why aren't you doing that for us? So anyway, we have done that for at least as an experiment. And new ideas and new perspectives and ways of thinking about things made me think about the way in which we can learn much more about things, as I've already said. It's also clear that there was a rising confidence locally, not necessarily universally, but certainly amongst some people, about the situation and about doing things in a way, or try to politic for things to be done in a way which was advantage to them. And it was around this time that I started talking more seriously to Sylvia and others about a special edition of the journal. Oops, sorry, wrong slide, wrong click. At this point, of course, COVID happened and created the chaos that we all know about. At this time, I was managing my department, so my free time or time to do interesting things was very limited. But there was two things during this time which really happened and made a great deal of difference, I think, to me. And we had a great deal of contribution from Latin America. In fact, the second one was really led by Latin America, by Sylvia and her colleagues. But the first one is that Alan, Barbara and I, as editors of the journal, decided to do this special edition on COVID. And what we basically did is we got contributions from 45 countries. I think 66 people wrote them. And we collated those, we did some review of those, and we published them in our journal as a special edition. We had contributions from those 5 countries from Latin America. I think that's the one that we had. I have a horrible feeling I've missed one off, but anyway. And reading those reviews, which was kind of personal accounts of the effects of COVID, and this was happening in March, well, sort of really May through to July, really, this was happening. I think it got published in the end in August, but there was lots of really difficult stuff to read about the inequalities, and about the technical issues, about engagement issues, about contact. There's one of the things, I think it was in the Colombian one, where it hadn't even occurred to me that one of the advantages of students going to university was they actually got accommodation and private space and got fed, because that's not something which comes to mind in my environment particularly. A whole lot of social issues and issues of faculty stress, which were coming across everywhere, I have to say. And issues of inertia amongst faculty, which is clearly something I experienced personally in my institution as well, but people not really willing to adapt to that new environment in which we were put into. But also a whole load of resilience and a lot of concern for the students. And another thing which was quite common across all of the countries really that contributed was issues about assessment and the ways that this linked in with professional qualifications or professional accreditation, or what the profession thought about these issues. But some of the issues that in this respect that were being brought up in the Latin American contributions were quite different to those which were brought up elsewhere and that were common to me. The other issue, which has nothing directly to do with QRCA, was breaking boundaries, although a lot of the same people were involved. I've put here the multi-everything book: multimedia, multi-language, multicultural. I don't know really where you end with that. But I was invited by Sylvia to be involved in editing this, and it was, you know, we would normally say a light at the end of the tunnel, but it wasn't. It was a light in the tunnel for me. It was a great way of thinking about things in a much more eclectic and a much more critical way about what was happening during this time. And we had some absolutely brilliant contributions from all around the world. I think one of the ones that I found really interesting was a video of people singing and dancing. But anyway, even though I couldn't understand the language, but it was really interesting things that were happening here, as well as some very thought-provoking written pieces. And working with the people that we were working with on that was really life-affirming, really, at a difficult time. And to my mind, a lot of the lead for that came from Sylvia and her colleagues. Clearly, there are others involved too. But, so anyway, I brought that up because it's kind of important, really, in what happens kind of next, really, in terms of the journal submission. Getting more coffee plants here. There were obviously lots of conferences and webinars and things which were involved over this period. And then obviously there's a conference now, but I'm not going to talk about this because I'm running short of time. And I apologise for this dreadfully green screen that is probably hurting your eyes, but I thought I'd better put something like my logo up somewhere. It's actually on 2 slides. I went to change the other one, but I forgot. So this special issue of the journal, which hopefully will be out sometime at the end of next year, it took a long time to build up, partly because I was concerned about how we might do it, partly because I had to get permission from other people about the multiple language process and how we set up that process, which, as it says down at the bottom here, we've allowed at least early round submissions to be in any language really that's used in Latin America. So we are expecting these papers to be published eventually in English, and I know that there is some discussion from Silver about whether we should be publishing in language too, but I didn't get permission for that, unfortunately. But anyway, so there was quite a lot of discussion about this, about how we might go about doing it, and we did manage to agree. So we had this call in November last year. The guest editors are shown on this page here. I think that's all of them. And then there's an editorial review board, which is doing all those early round reviews. And that's basically what's happened. And I thank everybody involved in this, before I go any further, really, for their contributions here. And I think that what they've done has been amazing, really. But in addition to, sorry, I'm losing my mouse here. In addition to actually sending out the call for papers, etc., through the QRCA, there have been several issues, several webinars or conference presentations and things that have been tied up with this, which have helped us on the way to getting contributions and into increasing engagement. And when I say increasing engagement, it is really interesting that we even got, I think for the first time, but certainly the first time for a long time, in our recent conference, the BAFA Accounting Education SIG conference in Glasgow last year, we got at least 3, maybe 4, I can't remember, contributors from Latin America visiting us, and 2 of whom actually were partly sponsored by the organisation, travel costs being paid, in order to get there as doctoral students. So we were trying to increase engagement, and it was really interesting that people came and presented at our conference. So I think that's kind of outgoing and quite interesting. Just a few bits of boring stats. The call ended relatively recently. We had pretty good response. Perhaps some journals get many more papers for special editions. This is a lot more than we've got recently for ours. And I think this goes a long way to those events on the previous slide, which helped to engage people and help people realise that the barriers weren't too serious. You'll notice we've got submissions from, I think it's 6 different countries, and Portugal, there's a joint, is involved in one of them as a joint. So these 31 papers, about half are from Brazil and the rest are spread around. In language terms, about half again are in Portuguese, quite a lot in Spanish, and a bit of a surprise to me, there's 6 of them are in English. I did expect to see some in English, but perhaps not quite so many. But anyway, that's what they came in as. In types and methods, I'm using the editors, the guest editors, analysis of this here. About half of them, I would say, are qualitative historical in their nature, which is a really good percentage, I think, because quite a lot of our submissions are normally quantitative. And I have to say, as a journal, we tend to prefer qualitative material. The American accounting education journals tend to veer to the other side. So that's why one of the reasons we go in that direction. So to talk a little bit about some of the topics, and this is really a list from some of the topics which were raised, and they're not really in that sense all that interesting what was presented, but the type of papers is. I will admit that my analysis of this is based almost entirely on the titles and the abstracts, partly because I don't think it's my right to double guess what the guest editors think these papers are about, and partly because time constraints and language translation issues. For me, I do only read in English or speak in English or do anything in English, I'm afraid. Something I'm very embarrassed about, but it is what it is. So anyway, so that's what the slides include, kind of the topics which, to my mind, have come out. Okay. I guess the issue of COVID in emergency responses was kind of obvious. In fact, probably a lot of the papers refer to this. A lot of the papers that are coming to the journal refer to it as an aside. But there's a difference between those which are about it and those which refer to it, in my view. some of these, like the lessons and satisfaction kind of ideas, are kind of straightforward in their kind of ideas. Issues about faculty stress and learning experiences. Sorry, the first one here, videos and gamification, are the sort of things which are coming in quite a lot of the time. They're not uninteresting, they're very interesting topics, but they're kind of the things we expect to get. The things about faculty stress and learning experience and the consequences thereof are things which we get less often, and I think are much more interesting and much more likely to lead to a change in the community, as opposed to an increase in the factory efficiency, if you like, of what we do. I'm not saying that's not important, it is, but it is something which is different. There were quite a few papers that seem to be submitted which were about content, professional development and skills in some form or another, curriculum content, specific technical issues, for example, things about data analytics and AI, and things about sustainable development goals, which is kind of what you'd expect, I think. Again, that doesn't make them uninteresting, it's just things which are quite common at the moment. There's something about generic skills, and in itself, generic skills is one of the things which we often deal with. I haven't seen a very good generic skills paper for some while, but talking about the way in which we might categorize those and talk about them might be looks from the outside as if something which is a little going beyond the kind of standard stuff. The other one there, which I think is interesting, is this idea of accountant stakeholders' perspectives, which it seems to me, from my brief look, is about how the clients of accountants see accountants and the skills and the attributes that they want to see. Sorry, I imagine that lunch and thing was coming up there, was it? That's obviously when my Zoom telling me what I should be doing. And there's also a paper about developing global mindsets in different ways. In fact, I think there's 2 papers on that with different kind of titles. But so these are interesting topics. They're topics which are coming up quite commonly, some of them, particularly those on the left-hand side. But the others look as if they've got a little bit more critical idea about how they're going to go about dealing with this and the issues that are being raised. I'm conscious I'm kind of running through short time. I'm not sure what time I started either, which doesn't help, because I forgot to write it down. So where am I going next? Okay, so the next page now. There was also a whole load of papers that are about learning technology issues, pedagogy issues. Some of these are, again, the kind of things that we normally see, but in a different context, and quite often with, it seems, with different kind of results or different kind of ideas coming about them. But there's a few which strike me as being different. One is about design thinking, something we've been talking about quite a lot in conferences and things, but I don't see very many papers on. Ideas about critical reading. So this is one of the issues which I think is massively difficult, massively important. We can't expect students to be critical thinkers if they can't read critically and think about the issues at stake in the authority of the text. And this seems particularly, I mean, I find it problematic in my classes, I'm going to be totally honest. But in a situation, and I can't remember which country this was in, so I might be thinking about this inappropriately in part, but it seems to me that in some of the Latin American countries, there seems to be a strong feeling of hierarchical dominance in thinking, in the sense that students are liable to think that their professor is definitely right, and professors are unlikely on the whole to encourage students to think otherwise. So this is a pretty important topic and very difficult in those sorts of circumstances. We have it too, largely with our international students. well, more so with their international students, I guess. And anyway, so it is a big issue in dealing with that in large classes. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how that paper runs out. The ideas of service learning or experiential learning are also pretty important. Not a lot of work been done on this because it's difficult to set up, but it's something which is really brings to mind the ideas of bringing students into the position where they have to learn through thinking about their construction of this approach to learning and how they build their kind of theoretical learning with it onto their practical experience, which is a really important aspect, I think, of the learning process. There's a paper here about, from my reading of the abstract, seems to be about faculty power. The appropriateness of that and the possible abuses are, I'm not sure if they're addressed here, an issue which is rarely discussed in the academic literature in this area, and something which I would really like to see being developed in some interesting ways, because clearly there are issues that have to be dealt with in terms of these issues. In the UK, there's a whole load of law and stuff about this to a large extent, or institutional practices which are try and mitigate against it. But I suspect it's an issue everywhere. But perhaps this has a particular Latin American perspective on this. Active learning, again, is really interesting. I think the mirror classes is something similar to the global mindsets. It's about study abroad substitutes, I think, which is again interesting. But the ones I'm picking out aren't necessarily the ones which are the best papers. I hasten to add, because I've not read those papers. I'm leaving this to the guest editors. There's no point having guest editors and then doing all the work at this stage oneself. We will be reading them later, clearly, but at this stage we're not. So anyway, so there's some of those learning and pedagogy topics. So some are kind of the run, what we normally see, and some of them look really interesting, seem to have some very interesting Latin American perspectives. There's also quite a few papers, as there are in this conference, about faculty issues or doctoral student issues, and I think this is part of accounting education. We don't just teach students to go out from their undergraduate or master's degrees into the profession. We also teach our students to become ourselves through the PhD model. So this is also part of the accounting education process, as is training in practice, etc. But there's some really interesting topics here and some really great ideas. And a lot of these seem to have quite an emphasis on critical ideas about making things better, about making things better for those who are disadvantaged by systems of power or systems of practices that are common within the institution, perhaps not even thought about. So there's some really interesting ideas in here, which I think we don't often publish stuff on this stuff, but I see no reason why we shouldn't, provided it meets our normal criteria standards, and I don't see why it can't. The last slide really is just a kind of an idea about thinking about critical potential. And this is the backdrop of this is actually the African Museum in Sao Paulo, and I use this particularly because I wanted to think about the minority, and though it's not really a minority, but thinking about the other ways of thinking about things and thinking about ways of making things better. There's these are some of the topics or the theoreticians who seem to come out from the abstracts. I'm really pleased to see Paulo Freire there, because I think he has a lot of very interesting things to say. There is some literature in our literature, if you like, about these approaches, but I think there's probably a lot more depth that could be said about that. There's some stuff which looks like it's about Foucauldian approaches. There's a couple of papers which talk about action research or participatory action research, which I think is a very interesting way of looking at accounting education. It's one where we have to be careful about some issues, but there's also a lot of ways of looking at things which you can't look at through other methods, things about emotions and the personal effects of things, for example. Perhaps some of those might be more autoethnographic or something like that, which might be another way of looking at some of these things. There's issues about socialization, which are important, particularly in terms of within, if you like, the academy, and socialization in workplaces, which is part of the way in which education shapes us. There's a paper which claims to be about phenomenographic approaches, and I see this as a really interesting way of looking at the ways that other people see what's happening in the situation. So I think that's interesting, and there's clearly quite a few papers that address issues of theory of gender and issues like this. And the tradition in my area, my literature, is largely to look at the performance differences on gender. I don't think that's a really interesting issue, although it is part of the gender issue, maybe suggesting that you know, we're doing things inappropriately for some genders, or we don't treat some genders appropriately the way we might best do that. Whereas historically, a lot of the accounting education literature that looks at gender just looks at performance differences and doesn't go much beyond that, which is a limitation, I think, of some of the existing literature. So I want to kind of finish up by talking about a couple of things. These are all pictures from Medellin, actually, Medellin, I should say. The conference that's happening today, or the last these 3 days, it's nice for me to see that there's still quite a few accounting education papers. I think quite a few of these papers look like they're from the same people who presented to the journal. Not all of them, but quite a few of them are. And there's also a couple of plenaries which address issues of education, at least directly or not. But anyway, really what I want to say in this last slide is to talk about, or the last substantive slide, really. I've got one other bit of advert and the question, but is to think about the contributions that come from seem to be coming from the Latin American contributions to my field of accounting education. First of all, we clearly have a community that cares, and you might think that's obvious, but it's not. I think the community that I'm more used to, the one that I work in, there are a lot of people who care for the students, care for teaching well or educating people well, but there's also an awful lot of people who don't. I don't know what proportion of your community cares in this way and what proportion, like some of my colleagues, but it's nice to see that there is a community that cares, and that community is building and is strong. I think it's important that we notice that there are a great deal of variety, and we don't treat Latin America as one place. It's not even one language. But it's clear that there's a lot of differences in the norms of what is accounting education and the norms of what counts as research. Some of that is reflected in my UK environment and in other parts of the world, in that my university is quite different from some others in terms of how much we concentrate on technical content, for example. We don't, other institutions do, but we do a lot of technical content. But we do a lot of other stuff too. But and also the issues about how things have developed and the historical background and how that shapes what's happening in each of these countries. Clearly, some of the countries have much more diverse, or one might say unstable political or whatever backgrounds to others over different periods, but they all have a unique past, which is worth thinking about, and thinking about how that affects what's happening. I think there's a lot of vibrant and challenging research coming out, which is some people saying things which perhaps we don't often being said in our discipline. Perhaps it's been said indirectly in other journals in our discipline, and some of that is the case. But even so, I think there's some really interesting work coming out which is challenging our current interpretations. There's a lot of work which is very critical in, I said in here in all ways. I think in my talk when I spoke in Bogota a few 3 years ago, I talked about critical in terms of being analytically critical, which is one of the things we always telling students that they should be. So there's clearly a lot of that sort of criticality in what's happening, which we don't always see, but it is something we always want. But there's also quite a lot of criticality in terms of wanting to change things. I guess that is in part because of the community of which these conferences, etc., are a part. But I think it's also important that we recognise that there are things to be done, that when we see mass inequalities the way that you do, in a much bigger way than we do, that it's much more imperative that things are done about it. Although I have to say, I think we can really learn a lot about those approaches because we do have disadvantaged communities. I think the speech after lunch is here talking about refugees, if I remember rightly. We have a lot too, and they're treated extremely badly in this country. And it's, as I said, it's important that we see people who care about the education of students. And I think there's an environment which we, others, whoever else can learn from, because of the many different factors that are of the environment in Latin America. I've put at the bottom here some towards extremes, and I don't mean that in a extreme in a bad way or anything else, but where you have differences which are more exaggerated, sometimes it's more easy to see the effects of those things. And it's important to think about how that work is then presented, not as this paper is special because it comes from Argentina, but this paper is special because in Argentina we have this particular issue which helps us highlight these particular problems or these particular issues or advantages even. So I think some of those things are really quite important to think about in that context. And I really am running short of time. I thought I was going to be finished much quicker than this. So looking about towards the future, just a reminder really, the first point about, as a journal, we are very open to qualitative. We want to be more critical and more enlightening in the research. What we publish isn't all critical in the big sense, but that's largely a factor of what's submitted. We would love to have a lot more critical and papers which think more about how we might make things better in a broader social context, rather than just improving the productivity of the factory. Sorry, the commercialized university, corporatized university, I think was Thomas's phrase. But there's also a really big complex dynamic around here. And that's partly about the status of accounting education within our institutions. Our institutions care about the money that students bring in, and we care about the students, but that's a secondary factor, I think, in many circumstances. I think it's a bit different in some respects in much of Latin America, but it's not entirely different. But it's interesting, there are dynamics about both of those issues, which I think could come out from future research in your areas. But I do always have at the back of my mind this concern at the bottom of the page here, which is, why should you want to or need to publish in my journal or the other English language journals? And in part, this, of course, is due to the increasing pressures of the corporatized university or whatever the ranking system or whatever it is that you're subjected to. But I think it's also important that we recognize that sometimes the best way to communicate to the educators in, let's say, Brazil, is through a Brazilian journal, or a journal that at least publishes in Portuguese. Similarly, a Spanish language journal may be better to get some issues across. And here we have this big problem about recognition and about the status of journals and what we, as the editorial, if you like, boards of international journals, the responsibilities we have to try and at least minimize those effects. And I hope we're doing this experiment we're doing helps in that respect, at least a little bit, although I'm sure it's not going to take away all the issues. But I really would like to see more critical research coming out, and I see your community as one of those where that's really kind of interesting. This is the advert. Sorry about the horrible picture of me. There are links in these, and these slides are available. I've sent them to Hugo and Sylvia and Carlos, so they are available. They're freely available to anybody who wants them. If you really want to, just don't nick all my photos, please. These two events are quite close to each other. We always arrange our conference, which is normally about 100, 150 people, close to the timing of the EAA one, so that people who are coming from abroad to go to the EAA can come to ours as well, or vice versa, and minimise at least some of the travel costs and some of the carbon issues. It is an in-person conference, only ours. And this is a conscious decision, because we have made a decision, which is we think the costs of hybrid are, particularly in terms of social space, make it more sensible to do it in person. But I know this is contentious, and I know that Sylvia doesn't really like me having made this decision, but that's what we have done as a committee. It's not really just me. And really some questions left for you. And I really like this bit of graffiti of the elephant, but I think it's been wiped out and the shop's changed shape since looking at Google Street Maps when I try to find out where it was. This is in Sao Paulo. What do you want to remember from this conference and this community in some senses, but what do you want or need from accounting education or accounting education research? Where do you want it to go, and what do you want it to do? And how does this community want to get involved in accounting education and the accounting education research community, of which I'm part, based in Europe, clearly. So that's where I'm going to end on that slide. Thank you very much. And I'm sorry if I've gone over time. I've got no idea when I started. But anyway. Over to you, Mary, if you want. Or Hugo.
Thank you, Greg. Excellent presentation. Unfortunately, we don't have time for Q&A because one of the problems of our, not problems, one of the issues is that we need to be right on time. I apologize with you and Professor Ahrens because we were a little bit late because of technical problem, but now we need to move forward because of the translation personnel. The interpreters are tired and they need to have a rest. But excellent presentation from my view, and I think I am speaking on behalf of all the community in the room and in the online session. So thank you again. I have any questions and comments, but I know you will be with us maybe in other sessions and we can interact maybe using the chat. For example, is this an experiment? How can we describe this experience? I don't know, it's experiment. It should be the word I will use, but I think we need to talk more about this. But thank you not only for your presentation today, also for your support, your commitment with this initiative. So thank you to you. I think Professor Ahrens is also in the online session.
So and if anyone has any questions, please do email me. It's no problem.
Just okay. Go ahead. 1 minute. Sorry.
I said just if anyone has questions, please email.
No question. Just saying, closing this session because of we have the technical issue of the translation. We need to finish. But thank you for your presentation. I think we had many questions to share with you later, maybe using the chat. So thank you again. And I'm going to switch to Spanish for some local announcements. Vamos entonces a una pausa para pues, continuar a las 2 de la tarde. La sesión será con la profesora Marcia Nicet a las 2 de la tarde. También se conectará en la plataforma online y posteriormente tendremos las sesiones de discusión de los papers. Entonces vamos a hacer nuestra pausa de mediodía y continuamos en unos minutos. Muchas gracias a todas y todos y todos y continuamos pues conectados en esta sesión.